for all you listeners out there, all 8 of you. Welcome to season 2 of the My OCD Care video series. This season focuses on courage. Oh, I'm sorry. This season focuses on courageous people. Google defines courage as the ability to do something that frightens someone. Often anxiety specialists focus on reducing anxiety, but it's very important to focus on an even more important aspect, in my opinion, which is boosting courage. You can be courageous whether or not you have anxiety. I believe acting courageously helps reduce anxiety's grip on your behavior, and it begets more courage in yourself and others in the future. In today's very polarized times, I find a particularly important area of courage is speech and writing. It takes courage to say what you believe to be true, especially if it goes against a particular narrative or orthodoxy. So the content of the speech itself, I think, is not as relevant as much as the willingness to say something that you believe to be true in the face of, knowing that some people may disagree loudly. So it's for that reason I chose to interview Ben Ryan. Ben, do you go by Ben or Benjamin?
Benjamin is what I use for just work because Ben Ryan is the world's shortest name, so it doesn't look very commanding as a byline. But no one calls me Benjamin.
Okay, so I'll call you Ben.
You can call me Ben. Ben is fine.
Okay. So it's for this reason I chose to interview Ben, who I know from X, formerly known as Twitter. X sounds pretty odd. I saw him posting pictures of the most hateful emails imaginable, which he seems to get regularly. And I get the sense when people email you things like that about something you said and not giving like reasoned refutations of what you were saying, you likely said something important. That's what I believe. So today I'll be talking about what he said, what the experience was like writing what he wrote and dealing with the consequences he faced, and I hope you'll enjoy. So a quick bio on Ben. I had it summarized from ChatGPT. Can I read it?
Okay, I didn't know. Last I checked, ChatGPT, the one I have on my phone, it knew who my brother was, but not me, so I was really pissed.
Oh, I actually took the bio from your website, and I said, condense it into 2 paragraphs and do it in third person.
Okay.
So tell me if there's anything, whether it did well. Okay,
Yeah.
So Ben Ryan is a distinguished independent journalist with a focus on science and healthcare. He has contributed to notable publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, NBC News, Thomson Reuters Foundation, The Washington Post, Atlantic, and many others. With a keen interest in public health, medicine, and psychology, Ryan delves into how these scientific domains intersect with public policy. His dedication to the field of health journalism is rooted in his 6-year volunteer work in the HIV sector, which began in 1995. As an editor at HIV Plus, POZ magazine, and its related publications, Ryan covered topics from HIV to cancer. He made significant contributions by revealing major public health issues, such as Governor Rick Scott's administration's blocking funds to tackle Florida's HIV crisis, and Governor Rick Lee's decision to cut federal HIV funds in Tennessee. I guess it's a Rick thing.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Additionally, he exposed Harvey Weinstein's controversial financial ties with the HIV charity AMFAR. A proud Columbia University cum laude graduate, Ryan's outstanding work has been recognized with awards from NLGJA. Yeah, what?
It's Bill Lee, not Rick Lee. The governor of Bill Lee.
Okay, Bill Lee. Sorry, Rick Lee. Yeah. The Association of LGBTQ Journalists. Okay, outside of writing, Ryan is a passionate photographer with his work featured alongside his articles in various publications. Born in Seattle to a general surgeon and English teacher, he spent his formative years at the Bush School and later relocated to New York City with brief periods in Paris and Los Angeles. In his leisure...
Sure.
What was that?
I think my phone sort of... All right, is it working now?
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
little glitchy, but that's fine.
Mhm.
Ryan interests range from reading diverse genres, enjoying the arts, biking in New York. That's very dangerous. That takes a lot of courage. To cooking and capturing photos. His resilience was recently tested when he was diagnosed with testicular cancer in December 2021. However, after undergoing treatment, he successfully overcame the ailment by August 2022, displaying admirable commitment by reporting on the monkeypox outbreak amidst his recovery. Does that
Or
sound like
during the treatment, not the
during the
proper. It was
treatment?
the mpox outbreak and my own illness coincided almost exactly. It's very strange.
Okay.
But
Um,
it was while I was in chemotherapy. My first time on a press conference with the White House was during my third day of treatment. I did a lot of work. I'd have an IV drip in my arm, so I was there 5 days a week, ultimately for like 20 days over a 10-week period. So I'd just be sitting there working all the time, and that was during my first week that I first even heard about monkeypox. So
wait,
now,
so you were a White House correspondent?
no, there was this. Well, the White House had run a press conference on over Zoom that I was listening in on.
Oh,
So,
okay.
but no, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So,
Mm.
uh, due to the limited attention spans of people these days, I'll jump right into it. Tell me a little bit about your coverage of the Mpox epidemic and your experience covering that.
So mpox was first identified in the UK in the middle of May, and shortly afterwards in the United States. And there were just a number of cases. This had been endemic only to about 11 African nations for a number of decades since it was first discovered. So this was a big change, and there was a lot of alarm in the public health community. And this, strangely, in my own life, coincided with me starting chemotherapy for testicular cancer, which I started on May 23rd of last year. And during my first week, I would spend 5 days in the clinic, and then I'd have 16 days off. And I did that 4 times ultimately. And then you get kind of sicker as you go along with each successive treatment cycle. So it was my first week in the clinic, and I was, on this webinar with the White House, learning about this thing called mpox, and then my editor at NBC News, where I've been writing as an independent journalist for some time, asked me to cover it, and I spent a couple of days just looking into whatever this was about, and then it quickly gelled with me, having myself written about HIV and LGBTQ health and public health and infectious disease for 20 years, and having been working one way or another in the HIV world since 1995. I saw immediately that this was something that was impacting gay men almost entirely, but that no one really wanted to say it out loud. There's a lot of tension in the public health world about being kind of exacting and explicit about how disparately STDs, STIs, they're also called, impact gay men, and how that's related to, say, modifiable behaviors, namely sexual behaviors. There's a lot of tension of not really wanting to say air the dirty laundry, if you will. So I was really clear to me that people were really steering around this. And this troubled me because I felt, and throughout the mpox outbreak, that my role as both a journalist and as somebody on Twitter and social media was communicating about this, getting a lot of traction and a lot of retweets and all that, was that it was the priority for me to communicate accurately and dispassionately about who this was impacting, why it was transmitting, and how what we did and did not know, how we knew what we knew, and how, what left there was to know, and things like that, rather than what I saw as a huge push in some of the gay community to massage the truth in hopes that it might land in the ears of the hateful community more gently, and that there would be less pushback. And my attitude toward that is, you're expecting me to be a magician and controlling public opinion in a way that is beyond my control and also not my job. That's the job of an activist or an advocate, advocacy organization, to think in terms of PR. People were asking me to think that way, and I was adamant from the beginning that my job was to tell the truth, and that my first priority, in fact, was to the people who were impacted by this, because what was happening is the CDC and others, and major publications who were following suit were really muddling the message, and they would say things like anyone can get monkeypox. And so that would be like the top line concept. So what that did is it effectively exaggerated the fear amongst people who are almost no risk, while depressing the notion that that gay men in particular were at very high risk. And it didn't communicate clearly enough that these are the behaviors that we're starting to identify are associated with contracting this virus, namely having new sexual partners frequently, and engaging in oral or anal intercourse between men, etc. Um, so, people needed to know this, gay guys needed to know this, and they needed to know kind of what they were up against. I spent a lot of June interviewing guys who were first getting the virus, and at that time they all fit a pretty uniform pattern. They were largely white, affluent. They did a lot of traveling, and they did a lot of traveling for the purpose of engaging in sex with new partners in different places. And so this is an ideal way to sort of seed, if you will, the outbreak across the world. And then it would go into other communities of people who didn't engage, who weren't that peripatetic, I guess.
Right.
So I interviewed a lot of guys about what they were experiencing, and it was really dramatic and shocking. The amount of pain that they were in, and they would use certain verbiage that I perhaps won't repeat here because it's so disturbing. A lot of them will use very similar like very hyperbolic, if you will, superlative rather, language to describe the kind of agony that they were in, and despair and pain, and some of them were hospitalized, had to be in a morphine drip, that kind of thing. So I remember it was a Friday night, and I was at that time getting increasingly ill from chemotherapy, and I was lying there just reading the paper on my phone, and I just sort of started tapping out a little tweet thread about what these guys were telling me, summarizing, this is what I'm learning, people, this is what they're experiencing. And it was one of the first tweet threads I ever had to go really viral, and I was really shocked and amazed because people really responded. They wanted to know this really badly. And it also and one of the powers of journalism or writing of any kind is to reflect back people's own experience in some way. I see myself in that. That is what I'm not alone. So that was sort of a preview of the article I published, which came out, I think, on July 3rd of last year. And the article, I was very proud of it because it flew in the face of the party line, which is that by and large, this infection had a largely mild manifestation. And this might have been true for some people, but for many people, it was not. And this ran contrary to the way the virus had manifested traditionally in Africa, where there wasn't that much transmission, but it generally would cause lesions in the arms and that kind of thing. And what was happening is because the virus was transmitting sexually, it was occurring in the rectum, in the genitals, and causing very severe pain. Those are very sensitive tissues.
Yeah.
That kind of a lesion on. So that was new, and there was something that the public health powers that be hadn't really caught up on. And so I was able to kind of communicate to the public information that they really knew, and to do it in a way that I thought was dispassionate enough that would minimize the impact of people being hateful. You can't stop people from being homophobic necessarily, but you can choose your words carefully in a way to try not to at least fan the flames, if you will. But this is a public health emergency, so I just always felt that my job was to communicate to the public, and that's what I did. So that I was very proud of that. And there was a lot of pushback, which we can discuss.
Yeah, so I'm hearing like you had a real value of like honesty in journalism, and you really believed it. At the same time, you recognized that it was an extremely sensitive issue. Did you realize, even if you did express it very, just fact-based and dispassionately, do you think that would have prevented, blowback about it?
There really was. I mean, you're never going to please everybody. And I remember my chemotherapy symptoms were really starting to get bad, and it gave me a kind of a mania or a monomania even. And it sort of synced well with the insanity of Twitter. It was a very short attention span. And I remember one day, I didn't get much sleep last summer. It was very difficult to sleep through all this. And I got up at dawn or something, and I was starting to tweet. This was in early to mid-June about monkeypox. And there's one guy in particular who absolutely despises me. And he's a combination of an activist, and he's a biologist, and he also was a writer, and he's very active on social media. And he was among the loudest voices that first started pushing back me when I was saying, like, this is something that is occurring overwhelmingly in men who have sex with men. And that was my main point. And he was infuriated. And I was making references to how people long did the same about HIV. They would exaggerate the risk to the general population. This is something that the CDC themselves, during the late 80s and early 90s, had a whole campaign that was grounded in communicating to the public that it could happen to you as well. And while that was true, it wasn't nuanced enough to explain how that might happen. And it had a kind. It was the intent of the campaign had a kind of a backlash, because what it did was it made people scared of HIV more than they necessarily had to be. And who did they think about and who were they going to blame this on? Was the gays. So I was seeing similar patterns, and I was saying that, like, no, we never saw this explosion within the heterosexual community in the way that it was warned of HIV. I was seeing the same kind of communication failures happening, where it was very often women in their late teens to early 20s who would tell me what gay history was like, and that the great failing during the AIDS crisis was that the press and so on had downplayed the risk to heterosexuals. And I was like, no, it's the opposite. They were silent about it because they didn't want to talk about what was impacting gay people. I that they were getting this wrong in service of, I don't know what exactly they wanted, but they thought they were real well-meaning, trying to fight homophobia, I suppose. But this person in particular, who really dislikes me, the academic / activist guy, and I was very public about having cancer on Twitter, and one of his followers, he would sort of say, he would do like a side-eye tweet, and while retweeting me, which is a way to recruit his followers to attack me. That's attacked people who, at the time, he had more Twitter followers than I did, but not anymore. This person said, should we feel bad that he has cancer? And the guy liked it, and I was really shocked. And this is my first foray really into this level of acrimony from people who inhabit my own professional sphere. This is somebody who works with people who I interview. You know, the very next day I was doing interviews for a story, and one of the people I was talking to told me, oh, you should call that other guy. And I was furious about what he had done with liking that particular post. And so people all that week kept saying to me, oh, you should talk to this guy. And I would just tell them how mad I was. And then he turned around and turned himself into the victim, that I was like parading around town blackening his name. And I was like, no, your name just
blackening the academic biologist name?
Yeah, okay. Like, your name just kept coming up, not by coincidence, but because you inhabit the world that I write about. And it's very strange to me. I don't quite understand the tactic of somebody who chooses to alienate themselves from the reporter who's covering the subject that they're an expert in, or supposedly an expert in. I mean, I wrote this guy a DM, behind the scenes, said, I can't believe that you do like that post. And he gave this brief apology and then just said, however, and then just laid into me how I was terrible.
Right.
So it was quite the non-apology. So it just went from there. And he ultimately, by the end of the summer, was so angry with, what I was writing in the Washington Post. I wrote a couple of op-eds about monkeypox. He wrote this, it must have been about 5,000 word hit piece about me and this other guy who was writing in the Atlantic, sort of similar arguments about how to discuss monkeypox with the public. So he threw a lot of energy into just being furious at me for what he saw is, hateful, but what I saw is necessary frankness when discussing public health.
Mm-hmm.
He's an emblem of a lot of people that, greatly dislike me.
Who published his hit piece?
It was some feminist website I'd never heard of.
Okay, so it wasn't the New York Times.
No. I mean, by the end of July, the Washington Post asked me to write a couple of op-eds, and the first one was essentially about how the CDC was misleading the public about who was being impacted by monkeypox. And then the second one, I sort of did a mini Larry Kramer act and said that, in the face of, there was this big delay of getting enough vaccine to everyone, that gay men should engage in sexual behavior change, to mitigate their own risk. And I I knew I was crossing. There's a big red line, which is in the HIV world, which is you cannot tell or expect gay men to change their sexual behavior, and this is born out of a lot of failures of efforts to do so. Essentially, people
Right.
realize that behavioral modification as a strategy in the HIV prevention world was a massive failure. So, but it
Mhm.
melded also with don't tell them because it's patronizing and ultimately hateful because the expression of sex is core to the being a gay man, and you can't touch that. So that's a total third rail. And I've been to multiple HIV conferences over the years, and read hundreds of papers, and this never comes up. You do not dare mention behavior modification. But this was different. It
Yeah.
was an acute emergency, and so I not only did I suggest this, and I listed, fewer partners are not going to sex parties, and I said something like, and even abstinence. And bringing up the word abstinence rings alarm bells amongst gays. And the big pushback that I was getting from a lot of activists and such were, how dare you mention abstinence when everyone knows that that's a failure? And I said, no, abstinence only education is a failure. It's really promoted, especially by the George W. Bush administration. And
Yeah.
still spends millions of dollars a year on these failed programs. It is
Right.
not successful at preventing teen pregnancy or reducing STDs because you
Right.
don't
Right.
give young people the full cornucopia of options of how to mitigate risk. It's not based on harm reduction. It's much more strict policy. But comprehensive sex education, which is effective on many levels, includes all these options as well as abstinence, which is what I just did.
Right.
So actually, I was only keeping in line with what comprehensive sex education actually is. But they just heard the word abstinence and absolutely went bananas. So that
Yeah.
eat up this guy's massive hit piece on me, which I read and I don't remember very well, but it was very based in sort of like arcane academic theories and minority stress theory, and I forget what else. You could probably
Right.
course modern exercise or something, but I just read it, and what are you going to do? I was just like, well, my piece was in the Washington Post and yours is going to be read by 14 people, so uh,
Right. I want to get back to that moment. You described
mhm,
it as like
mhm,
chemomania,
yeah,
right? Like right before you sent this tweet thread
mhm,
that you believed in and that you also recognize may cause people to get offended,
mhm,
but you believe it to be true. Was there something like existential about that moment?
yeah,
Or like, could you describe like what that moment was like right before doing something like this,
mhm,
doing something like maybe like
yeah.
your courageous moment, if you will?
Well, I had phone brain and I was starting to kind of settle in and discover what that meant and how that would impact my ability to work. And it settled in. I would go through the treatment Monday through Friday, and then, by the next Sunday, Monday, you were really starting to feel really bad. And then it would start to ease up again by the end of the 16-day break period. And it would just get worse and worse with each successive treatment cycle. So that first week after was when I was first assigned to cover monkeypox by NBC, and I turned in my article. I was so proud of myself because it was really difficult with the cognitive dysfunction. And my editor
Right.
said, this isn't at all what I asked you to do. And here's the assignment email. I said, oh my God, that didn't register in my brain at all. And I give up. I'm not going to work for the entire summer. And she sort of nicely fixed it for me. We worked it out. And then I was able to establish enough confidence that I could figure out shortcuts and ways around. But I remember interviewing people, and my typing became extremely abstract expressionist. And so I was in a fog, but at the same time, because I had such a lengthy experience in learning about HIV and gay sex and its association with public health and infectious disease, I knew not only how all these things transmit, what the behaviors are, etc., but also I knew very well how the powers that be prefer to talk about it. So I
Mm.
could see clearly almost immediately what was happening because there was sort of patterns I was very familiar with from writing about HIV, and in particular, I'd written at great length about pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, which is the HIV prevention pill, which is
Right.
approved in 2012. And there were a lot of ways that I saw academics. I don't know if they were lying to themselves, or the public, or their colleagues, or what, but no one wanted to acknowledge and admit or state that taking these pills for HIV prevention was associated with a decline in condom use or increases in.
Hmm.
sexual risk taking, such as greater frequency of partners. No one wanted to admit this. And anyone who ever just take one cursory glance at what's going on in the gay community could tell that this was true. But the academics were so insistent. I mean, the very first time I ever brought this up with the guy who actually created PrEP, essentially, he was the lead author of the main paper that got it approved in the first place. I
Who
said,
was
oh,
the doctor?
his name is Robert Grant. He's at UCSF.
Okay.
I was interviewing him in early 2014, and I said, "Yeah, I've got this, friend or two wants to go on it so they can stop using condoms." And he flew off the handle. He got really angry with me. He said, "I've never heard that. No one, none of my patients in all these trials have ever said anything like that." I was really amazed by the pushback, and it was so detached from reality. So this continued over time, and I was very familiar with this kind of groupthink, as well as a kind of omerta, if you will, about like don't air the dirty laundry.
Yeah.
So I remember sort of asking myself, you're a little out of it right now. What if you make a big mistake and you come out really publicly, saying that this is, largely transmitted by sex between men, and this is how we know. What if you're wrong? I would get in these fights with these crazy doctors on Twitter who were so adamant that this virus was a great risk to children and women, and once the schools open, everybody was going to get it. It's going to be a catastrophe, and we should all wear masks. And this
That's
kind
what
of
I thought during this time. I thought I was
yeah,
at a high risk,
right.
boring married
You
guy.
you were
Right?
being,
Like I
I don't
thought
know,
like
lied to.
it could happen anywhere from going to the subway or something.
People who thought they were experts in this perhaps were very well meaning, it turns out weren't. And I'm not a doctor, so I don't have that level of credential. And people figured out very quickly that I majored in English at Columbia, so there's a presumption that I don't know what I'm doing. And I might think that, if I were looking at myself, because like, well, where are the credentials? And the answer I have to that is, well, I did learn on the job. And when you spend 8 years writing, churning out study after study that you cover for an HIV magazine, you do learn eventually what you're doing, hopefully. I'm very proud of my position and my fact checking and being very humble in the face of, finding what experts know. But in this case, the experts often were not necessarily being deceitful, but they weren't telling the story correctly as far as I could tell. So I would check myself and like, what if you're making a great mistake, especially given that you're totally out of it right now? But I just had this great conviction that like, no, I know exactly what's happening. I'm so clear headed, and, just sort of went for it. And, speaking to anxiety, I'm, generally a very anxious person, but one of the great things about chemotherapy, or a great thing, many bad things, obviously, was that, and a friend of mine who was also experiencing chemo for breast cancer at the same time last summer confirmed this as well, was that my tendency to ruminate was essentially interrupted because my attention span
Mm,
was made very short. So if you think of ruminating as a spiral, there was just like a block. It would just run into something every time, and it couldn't get there. So normally,
wow,
if
that's
I
so
say
interesting.
something really bold, or I maybe get mad at someone, I would normally sort of retreat and then ruminate over it. Oh God, did I hurt their feelings? Are they mad at me? This is terrible. Am I going to get into some sort of trouble? I was incapable of engaging in those thought patterns. And I was very aware of this. And it allowed me a certain freedom to be much more bold in my communications.
Yeah. So I
To
get
not
the
care
sense also
that
that your
people were mad at
boldness
me.
came from confidence in yourself, right? Like like yes, you questioned yourself, like maybe I
Yeah,
don't know everything, but like you have such a specific history
yeah,
that allowed you to meaningfully contribute
yeah,
and even correct the record
yeah,
that empowered you to say what you know to be true.
mhm,
So
yeah,
I guess part of courage comes from like confidence, and confidence comes from doing the
yeah.
work, you know?
Well, exactly. And I'm there are a few public intellectuals, if you will, who weigh in on myriad topics expertly. Uh, he's often a controversial figure, but I think that Matthew Iglesias is genuinely, a polyglot, polymath type who knows what he's
Yeah.
doing. Amazed how expertly he can weigh in on different topics. Whereas a lot of people who attempt that, you can tell that it's very shallow, that they don't know much below just a reactionary posture. They're ideologues. So I don't have a lot of respect for people who pretend to know everything about myriad topics. It is no
Yeah.
one has time to do that much reading. Like Glenn Greenwald, for example. I always joke that no one who plays tennis that many hours a day and spends that much time on Twitter and on camera has the time to, behind the scenes, do the reading required to understand the world from every single angle and be right about everything. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
You know,
And I'll say one thing more about credentials. Like,
right.
for
That can
example,
be misleading, you know.
yeah, totally. Like Kelly GA, that Twitter account.
Hmm.
Are you familiar with her
Right.
story? You
Kelly
know,
J is a perfect example.
she was just
Who
like
does not have
following the
credentials.
data,
Yeah,
and
but it's like,
she was like correcting so many things off the on the record
right.
from the CDC, and I thought that was like, someone without really any
Yeah.
credentials, did such effective work.
Hmm.
And
Speaking
on
of,
the
use the
yeah.
word just now. I meant polymath. Excuse me. So, which is an ironic to think, but I'm talking about people who know everything, and then I misuse a word. So,
Yeah, I also think, on the flip side of things, sometimes credentials work against you. Like I remember like when I just got my PhD
hubris.
in clinical psych,
Hmm.
I'm like, oh, I know everything. I have a PhD in clinical psych. And you
Yeah,
almost like don't put the pressure on yourself to
totally.
actually do yeah, like I feel like you kind of just, I have my credentials,
Mhm.
like I know things just because I know things.
Right.
I have a credential. But I feel like if you don't have a credential, you have to do the work. You have to double check every study. And I learned that over the course.
There
Yeah.
wasn't that much material you needed to read. There were very few papers about it. There were a few major sources of data. They were constantly being updated. And, you'd sit in on these meetings with CDC and you'd listen to the audio. And so it was possible if you spent a certain amount of time to know the lay of the land. So there were plenty of people who didn't do this really moderate amount of work. And that's, what I was doing. And yeah, and again, I had been doing the homeworks, for that point, 27 years for this type of thing. So
Yeah,
I
so you
really
were ready.
knew what I was doing. I could sort of weigh in with some level of authority. In fact, and I know they're kind of controversial, but Vinay Prasad and I don't know how you pronounce her last name, is Tracy. It's spelled Hoog, and there's like a line through one of the O's.
Tracy
Like,
Death.
they're at UCSF, and they did this preprint that they put out a couple months ago, where they analyzed "quote unquote" experts on Twitter. This included people who were doctors or science journalists or lawyers, and there might have been one other category, who were weighing in on Twitter about the risk of monkeypox to
I saw
children
that
in
paper,
schools
yeah.
and daycares. So they did this analysis, and I was very proud of this because by and large, the doctor experts were terrible and everything they said was wrong, and they were way over on one level of this column. And then the science journalists and such, like, were pretty decent, and they're like, the average weight of the science journalist was drawn, all the way over to one end, by and large, by a single person, and that was me, like sick at home with chemo, just like tweeting all evening
You were
on the
in that
couch.
article?
Yeah, they mentioned me by name, that I was
Cool.
by and large the only person who was like leading the charge of saying what was true about this. So that was great to like have it in print. But
That's
speaking of
so
credentials,
cool.
people who don't like Vinny Prasad because he's quite the controversial contrarian, if you will, when it comes to COVID in particular. I've said, someone the other day was trying to say I didn't know what I was saying about something, and I was like, well, it's literally there. It's been studied that sometimes I know what I'm talking about, and these doctors.
You have a
But all
citation
they said
for
was that
your
Prasad is
correctness.
evil, and you can't trust anything that he says. And I'm like, even if he, you don't like what he does, or like maybe he's done other things wrong, you're not speaking to the substance of the paper itself. You're just trying to discredit the author.
Yeah,
So
I'll
that,
go on the record as a big fan of
shallow argument
Vinay
tactic.
Prasad for sure.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting. Like you mentioned something earlier about like you had something to publish, and you got like this pushback from your publisher that seemed based on like for PR reasons why like certain
Wait, which part was that?
earlier, right in the beginning of the story,
Oh,
almost like this idea of like because it goes against a
that
certain.
was never from any of my editors. Like I never had that problem with it. It was the public. It was there's a certain stripe of gay activists, extremely online types, who have a kind of
Oh,
dogma was to discuss gay sex in particular. So that is where the pushback was coming from. It was very clear. It
okay.
was very,
So it wasn't like the big institutions telling you what to write, what not to
mm-mm.
write, what to say or not to say.
No,
Right,
I never had,
that's promising.
yeah,
And at
never
the same
once.
time, well, it does sound like you did have information that could have been available to a lot of these big health organizations, but because of PR reasons, we're not informing the public accurately, right? I
Right.
mean, that sounds kind of scary, no?
It is. It's troublesome to, how you might trust or mistrust certain institutions, the CDC in particular. So, Dimitri Daskalakis was at the time the HIV prevention director of the CDC. They kept taking him off the job to go work on COVID, and they took him off to be the monkeypox deputy lead in the White House, I believe was his title. And it was in August, and there was a Zoom meeting with the LGBT journalist corps, and he opened the meeting. The very first thing he said was talking about essentially the exceptions to the rule. This virus may be a risk to all these people, and everyone who wasn't a gay man. And I remember just being so incensed by that and asking him, why is it that what you led with was the exception to the rule? And you're talking to LGBTQ journalists here. And his reaction was essentially to compliment himself and think he'd done a great job, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And, they're essentially, it's the mix of politics and public health that I think is very toxic. And that's a theme that I've seen consistently, was that public health, if done dispassionately based on science, can be very effective, but is often dragged down when political winds start to affect its direction, which is, they're always doing the best job even without the influence of politics, but
Right.
their desire to kind of make themselves look good and not to offend and to worry about the trajectory of their own careers can really impact their ability to be honest with people. And indeed, Daskalakis, as of yesterday, was promoted to a higher position. He's leaving the MPOX post now. So to that point, he sort of navigated this role very well for himself.
I guess that's the formula for success in that industry.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, that you deal with some anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think I think you're very courageous in your journalism. Whether or not you think so, I think so. So how do you reconcile, dealing with anxiety with kind of acting courageously in your journalism?
I guess, going back to what I said of just the conviction of knowing that you know what you're doing, I'm precise, my fact checking, to the point it's almost irritable to editors of how insistent I am of changing little details, but making sure that what I'm writing is based on the literature, some sort of research, etc. So knowing that I'm not just going out there based on my own opinion, this is grounded in science, essentially. So that way I'm being deferential to other experts, but also just being discerning and knowing when certain experts maybe aren't on the ball. There was one guy in particular, Jeffrey Klausner, who is a longtime HIV expert who's at USC, and he used to be in the public health department in San Francisco. And he and I really got to being chummy. We'd DM on Twitter and we'd text and that kind of thing. And he was really out front in publishing papers about how this was largely a sexually transmitted infection. No one wanted to say that. They wanted to say that, similar to what had been happening in Africa for decades, that skin-to-skin contact, quote unquote, was the primary driver of transmission, and that guys were having perhaps intercourse often, but it was the skin-to-skin contact during intercourse that was the main source of transmission. But this really started to make no sense with the papers that were coming out. The placement of the lesions, within the rectum, on anal tissue, that sort of thing. The infections were very sourced around the genitals. So, and it really made sense, what I knew from HIV and how the tissues in the rectum and the anal tissues, are much more easily damaged. There's a lot of immune cells that are right there that can sort of suck up HIV, if you will, that they're the target of the infection. So, I knew that it's much easier to transmit a virus through anal sex than it is through your arm. This is called keratinized skin. It causes. It's a shield. So it just didn't make a lot of sense that it was the body's touching that would have transmitted virus that was largely focused on the genitals in its presentation. And
Right.
I was like a Saturday night, and I started texting him. I was like, I really want to write a piece about how this is sexually transmitted. He's like, I've got this paper coming out, right now. And so we were sort of having a bit of ESP there. So, my anxiety about publishing something is usually pretty minor once I get to the point where I'm going to press send, because I've done the work to make sure everything is correct in there. I remember when I was doing the piece that you mentioned about Harvey Weinstein, and he effectively laundered money through AMFAR, this HIV charity, through a scheme involving a gala. He needed some money for this nonprofit theater, and he had this package that they auctioned off at the gala, and he got some of the runoff for himself, and it effectively caused him to profit by sending money to this nonprofit theater that had agreed him to reimburse him for raising money elsewhere. Sorry to tell you about that convoluted scheme, but
Yeah.
it was like a 10,000 word draft, and we were going over it with this lawyer point by point, and the lawyer said to me, we're getting to the very end, is there anything in here that you're unsure about and you think might be incorrect? And I thought for 1 second, I just said no, because my system of fact checking is so exacting that I knew the answer already. So it was that easy for me to answer, like to a lawyer. So I'm often very anxious in writing something and how do I put this all together and will I be able to do it, that kind of thing. But I'm almost never anxious about publishing it because my system is
Right.
so exact at fact checking it. I've almost never had to run any substantial correction.
Yeah, it's almost like truth is a comfort blanket, and like knowing that you have the truth on your side, it seems like you're able to push forward and
Yeah,
like whatever the consequences are, like the truth needs to come out.
yeah.
And I think
And
that's
people
like
are coming at me on Twitter and saying, you're evil and you're a malignant force in the world and such. And I just say, well, you're welcome to go to my website, where's the entire archives of everything I've ever written, and find something that I published that you don't like. And they never do. The one thing the other day, they were very angry that I published, I think, 2 different headlines with NBC that said something effective like sex between men is fueling the mpox or the monkeypox outbreak. And the use of that active verb, to fuel, or sometimes I use to drive, infuriated a lot of gay activists, because essentially the way I think that they see it is that when you're talking about a stigmatized minority experiencing some sort of ill effect, you're not really allowed to say that this was a cause of their own behavior and modifiable discretionary behavior, but that it's always couched in structural terms. This is a result of homophobia and stigma and so on. And people are kind of forced in their own behaviors by societal influences. And true, it is also true that oftentimes these behaviors are modifiable, and that using verbs that convey that is not bad. What do you want me to
right.
say? People sort of tripped and started having sex by accident. They made a
Not
conscious choice
not a common
to
event.
engage in behaviors, and they can also make a choice should they wish to protect themselves, and importantly, to protect other people as well. That's something that is often lost in the discussion of public health, health-seeking behaviors, is our larger responsibility as members of community to our fellow person. So that really bothers me, that level of insistence on backing away from discussing how we can, by some discretion, choose to do things that are healthy for ourselves, but also to others. And that should we not think of that almost first and foremost, that we have a responsibility to the people around us. And, to sort of segue, like that's how I felt my job was. And it was my responsibility to communicate accurately to the public. And outside of, all the anger that I would get from people with regards to this, the constant messages I was getting from people, just like, thank you so much. I was really confused. I didn't understand what the risks were. You communicate this to me accurately and clearly. I would get parents writing me saying, I'm really worried about my kid going to school. And I'd have to be really careful, because I couldn't just say, like, I know everything about this subject, don't worry.
Right.
That's really beyond my role. But I would say, well, look, here's the numbers that I've seen. And I did sort of back the napkin calculations. you can get a rough denominator of how many gay men. There's about 6 million in the United States, and there's something like about 160 million adult men and women respectively. And then I can't remember, there's like 70 million children or something. So if you just look at the data, you can do a rough per capita estimate. And I can't remember the exact number, but gay men seem to me apparently had a monkeypox rate that was, I believe, over 10,000 times greater than women or children. So you
Pretty
can
significant.
like each case, and the way that human brains are structured, we like stories. We don't respond very well to data. We remember stories much better. So the first baby to have HIV, everyone goes crazy. Even though it's one in several million babies that were born that year. They remember the one baby more, the fact of like literally, I was like, well, how common is a lightning strike? Oh, more common. And I was like, you're more likely to get literally struck by lightning than this happening to your child. So just being able to at least convey those figures to people, they could hopefully. And to speaking to anxiety, I myself am often very anxious about bad things that might happen to me, worrying like, oh, I did this. Is this gonna, I went out there and am I gonna get COVID and long COVID and worry about that sort of thing. So I I think it's a shame that journalists and other public health figures don't often think, it's often a great thing to assuage people's anxieties to say, right now, or in this capacity or in this circumstance, your risk is low. Like you have good reason to worry less. And this is something we saw a lot in COVID, they seem to want to leverage fear as a controlling mechanism as
Right.
opposed to I don't know, finding some more positive form of psychology to motivate people rather than just controlling them through fear. You should be afraid of this, and that should lead you to use whether it's a condom or a mask or what have you, um, as opposed to motivating them more with a carrot, I suppose, so to speak, than a
And I
stick.
think that's even what comprehensive sex ed is about, is like give
Sure,
people the
exactly.
information they need and let
Right.
them, encourage them to make, healthy
Yeah.
decisions for themselves based on
Yeah.
information versus like scare tactics of
Scare
abstinence
tactics don't
only.
work,
Yeah.
and that's something that's been shown
I,
repeatedly. And
I hope they would
HIV
learn.
prevention in particular. I think I was in the ninth grade. I went to a very progressive school, and if the teachers had any idea this was going to happen, they never would have invited this person. But we were subjected to a horrifying slideshow of of the manifestation of STDs on people's bodies, and they would show these slides, and we were screaming and hiding our faces, and the teachers were wanting to die who were in the room. And every fifth slide was a picture of like a mountaintop or like an elk or something so that we calm down. It took me many, many years to realize that what I had been shown that day were the world's worst manifestations of herpes, or what have you. And that in fact, the typical manifestation, is more mild, etc. And that I had been subjected to very damaging scare tactics. And I really resented that person at that point. But that she was being dishonest, and you need to give people a sense of what the scope of the risk really is, and not
Right.
just use scare tactics to try to control their behavior, especially with something as highly motivated as having sex. People have libidos, they're going to do it. um, this is ridiculous, but I just remember 90210 when I was a teenager, and Donna Martin, her mom was really into like abstinence only education. And she pipes up one day, she's like, what if you had a swimming pool and your kids just really wanted to swim and you could do everything you could and tried to build a fence around it? But ultimately, don't you think you should teach your kid how to swim? And everyone's like, Donna finally said something really insightful. Donna,
I should rewatch
I can't
that.
believe it. I can't, and I can't believe I just remembered that. But it was a really good point of like
Yeah.
of the importance of harm reduction as a technique.
Yeah. And this idea of the noble lie,
Oh
you know,
yeah,
you only get one, right? And then
exactly. And that's what people
your
were
credibility is
engaging, were a
shot.
lot of noble lies, and that compromises credibility and trust. And we saw
Hmm.
that over COVID,
For sure.
and it's a real shame.
Yeah. Do you need a run now, or do you have a?
Not exactly, but no, I don't have like a hard out.
Okay, cool. So I'll ask a question. You can tell me whether or not
Hmm.
I can include it.
Yeah.
Uh, so in one of our Twitter discussions, um, okay, so you wrote it's chemo related. Is that cool? I mean, you were mentioning it. Okay, so you wrote, for what it's worth, what I told people when I started chemo last summer was that I wasn't going to be one of those starry-eyed folks who bathed in the power of positive thinking.
Yeah.
Instead, I would have courage, which is fortitude in the face of very real fear. So I agree on the definition. I'm curious about what courage looks like in the face of cancer. Like what
I'm
is it?
trying to find a book really quickly on my shelf. Hold on. Might have to cut this part while I look for it. Where is Right Sided? Sorry about this.
I'm just going to make a signal so I know where to.
Okay. This book. I love this book. Like, does that come out backwards or forwards when you look at it?
No, that's right.
Yeah. So this book, Bright-Sided, How Positive Thinking is Undermining America by Barbara Ehrenreich, was a real lodestar for me. And it gave words to what I have been observing, which is this pressure in the United States to be cheery about everything, to only look on the bright side, to suppress negative thoughts. And then that can be very damaging. And she opens it with discussing having had breast cancer, I believe it was, and how she found that there was a lot of scientific misinformation that said to her that you have to look on the bright side and have rose-tinted glasses, or you're going to die. And that was to her, somebody who is very logical-minded and, kind of a crank, frankly. So I felt the same way. I had had surgery the previous December, but when I was ultimately diagnosed with a recurrence of cancer last April, it was really important to me that I not go into it thinking that I was going to sail through it cheerfully,
Right.
but that I would be courageous, and that being courageous means having fortitude in the face of great challenge. And so that's essentially how I focused my energy and just tried to deal with all the waves as they hit me. And it was very difficult. I mean, the amount of side effects that I had to juggle was ultimately devastating and really life-changing. And people I'm around a lot these days to an excess that I don't necessarily approve of. But the week after my last treatment alone was so traumatic to what happened to my body and to my insides, to just be life-changing. I'm still kind of recovering from it. So that was the 1 week that I did not do any work. 7 days. My last day of treatment, I just lay in the bed with my IV in my arm, just watched like John Hughes movies.
Right.
And it didn't work until the following Friday. And then I sat down, then I said, oh God, I'm working on 5 articles right now. And just went back to it. But I guess I just sort of held to that, was trying to just think of yourself as, I guess, cross-country skiing through a squall, not a squall, whatever it is, a snowstorm, a blizzard, and just trying to steel yourself against it, I guess. But also to acknowledge when you were suffering and that this was really terrible and you shouldn't downplay it.
Wow. So it's like almost
dealing with it.
Yeah. So it's almost like another like a theme of like courage being acceptance of reality and commitment to reality, right? Like you're not gonna like lie to yourself that everything's great.
Yeah.
You're gonna like face the facts, like it is what it is.
Yeah.
And you're gonna live in that reality. And I think similar to like journalism, like the facts are the facts. My life is journalism, which is clear if you're doing it while taking chemo.
Yeah. I guess people were very surprised at how it was, both to friends and family and emails and Facebook posts and but also on Twitter. But I guess it was just sort of in keeping with my writing, frankly, about health in general, that I would do the same about my own. One of the long-term impacts that I have of chemo is searching for words. So if you haven't noticed, like I couldn't remember the word blizzard. I misused polyglot earlier. So that's very frustrating for me. And I'm the most on stage when I'm speaking live like this. If I'm on the radio, let's say, I get very self-conscious about sounding erudite.
Well, you definitely sound erudite. And
while we're speaking, I'm sort of racked with anxiety and a lot of sadness because chemo impacted my brain and it's sort of stolen from me a bit, at least, the thing that I'm most proud of, which is, you know, being eloquent essentially, and big reader and all that kind of thing. So, and of course, like now I can't remember what I was going to say
Yeah.
about just going through cancer. Let me, if we could just sort of like stop here because I'm trying to remember what you were saying something about, oh, being honest about reality.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Like
okay.
courage being like just
Well, I remember that it was right before I was gearing up for my third treatment, and I was feeling okay. And I had a couple friends over to dinner because the only thing I felt like I could do was cook. So I just stayed in
Mhm.
and cooked. And all of a sudden, I'm like, now I need people to come over. This is odd because everyone was saying they should cook for me, and now I'm cooking for them. So a couple of people happened to come over, and people would often, I think what they said that really bothered me, they said, "Oh, you're three-quarters the way through." I said, "No, that's not the way that I see it. I'm three-quarters the way through the treatment, but I always thought that the real worst of it would be 100 days, which was true in the end. It was essentially Memorial Day to Labor Day in a great summer, you know." And I can't
Mhm.
remember what he said, but he was trying to frame it in a more positive light. And I was like, I said, "No, it's actually really bad, and here's why." And I got really annoyed and I probably alienated this person forever. I said, "No, you're saying those things for your benefit. You want to feel better about what I'm going through." And I was so forceful about it and adamant. I think he probably thought I was being a real jerk. Although I sometimes hope these people would just forgive me, being like, well, he was on chemo, so I guess we'll let
Yeah.
him get mad. But I saw that a lot. People, a guy in my gym, I said, "Oh, I have to tell you, I got recurrence of cancer. I'm gonna have to have chemo." And he did this. He flinched. He said, "Oh, you're gonna do this, dude. You're gonna be great. It's okay. You're gonna get through this." And I saw him do this tap dance. He put on this whole musical number of positive thinking. And and this is something I also experienced when my mother died of brain cancer when I was 20 in college. And I would tell people my mother's dying of cancer, and they would get all upset, bent out of shape, and you could just see them contorting and dying inside. And it became my responsibility to change the subject so that they would not be upset. I deeply resented this, but it would just became a part of my responsibility of getting along the world with anybody and not having them resent my very presence, which was to deal with how they felt about my problems. Uh,
Yeah. What was your favorite response when you told people?
oh, that's a really good question. Nothing stands out because I remember the bad ones more. Um, so I guess one of the things that I often tell people when say they have somebody who's dying or their loved one is dying or very sick or something of that nature, they often say, "I don't know what to say." And people are very often paralyzed in this dynamic. And very often what they choose to do, and people told me this, that they did this with me last year when I was in chemo, was then there's this accumulation of embarrassment that they let time pass, and this paralyzes them even further. So they have two choices: to finally just shatter this embarrassment, apologize, and talk to the person, and then confront their fear of saying the wrong thing, which is their greatest fear, saying the wrong thing,
Hmm.
back away permanently, and not say anything to the person, and free themselves from the discomfort entirely by forgetting about them and writing a story in their head of why it wasn't their fault. And people have told me that they did these things. They're like, "Oh, well, I didn't talk to you all summer because I thought you were mad at me." I'm like, "Well, eventually I was because you stopped talking to me all summer." And so what I say to people when they don't know what to say is, listen, that person does not expect to say the perfect thing because there isn't any perfect thing. What they would like is to hear from you that you care about them, validate that their suffering is real, and that you are there as a support in whatever way is best for them. And not everyone is the same, of course. I had a friend, whose loved one
Just
died.
slow that down 1 second. Can you
Yeah,
like say those steps again? Because that sounded
yeah.
pretty
It,
profound.
it's to, for one thing, talk to them at all. Tell
Yeah.
them that you're there from them to listen and to validate their suffering. What they're going through is very real. They have every reason to be upset by this. And to communicate to them in whatever way possible that you will continue to be there for them in a way that's best for them. Some people don't want
Mhm.
a lot of calls. I had a friend whose loved one died, and we're known her forever, but she isn't the type of person to want to talk on the phone several times a week about how sad she is. So it was very difficult for me to figure out how to be supportive outside of just showing the person that you're there for them in some way that might work for them. And you can even
Wow.
ask. I remember saying to people, there was one friend in particular. and because I knew this would be a problem because I'd seen a little bit with my surgery, which is a more minor experience. It wasn't that bad.
Mhm.
But going into chemo, all the doctors say to you, we don't know how you'll react. Everyone reacts to this differently. So we can't say what your experience is going to be like. We can say that they each get worse and the fourth one will be really bad. It was essentially a curve like that, the cumulative. So the fourth one was like 4 or 5 times worse than the third one. And so I remember telling this friend, I don't know what sort of support I need, but I need your support. Period. That word I kept vague because I didn't know what it meant. And this one particular friend that really registered with him, so he would just call me on video chat a lot and just ask me how it was and discuss things. And that meant the world to me because there were many other people who stopped talking to me. There were 6 people. I lost 6 friends from having cancer. They abandoned me. Some of them abandoned me wholesale. A couple of the others were just so awful, I just had to stop talking to them. But I was expecting this to happen, and it did.
Yeah, I wonder if they kind of had a good crash course on the needs of people who are going through that. Maybe it would be
It,
helpful.
I don't know. I mean, there was, we were mid conversation over text. One guy I've known for a number of years, uh, just ended it.
Yeah.
Stop responding. And I asked him, I was like, I think you've stopped talking to me. And if so, that's a shame, but I won't talk to you. I won't contact you again. And he didn't write me back. So,
Okay. How are you
yeah.
feeling now?
Um, it's been a difficult identity shift. A lot happened to me career-wise in the last year, for one thing. So with the monkeypox and other elements. So that's changed. My options of what I can do with my work have changed and broadened, which gives you the paralyzing sort of surfeit of choice. It's a lot harder to decide which way to go, and all of a sudden your avenues are pretty wide. So that's coincided with my very long recovery from chemo and the trauma of it all, as I said earlier, and again, I don't like to throw that word around lightly, but I think I can say that the fourth cycle was extremely traumatic. That and just, I mean, these things are extremely toxic and they really damage your CNS. So I have neuropathy, trouble remembering words, and I'll get these spells of fatigue that can they're like very slow weather patterns. They just sort of come in and they last for a week, 3 weeks, and then they leave. And I don't really have any control over them. So it's been very difficult to assess my capabilities, how I feel day to day, who I am after going something like that, and also reassessing my friendships and having fewer friends, and trying to build that up again after having gone through that. And dealing with my anger and disappointment over how people treated me. Not everyone, mind you, but the bad ones really stick out. Some people were wonderful. They were extremely supportive. You know, my brother came out, like it was a really nice time for us to kind of build something new, if you will. So that was quite wonderful, positive thing that came out of this. But it speaking, more to subject at hand of being public on Twitter, let's say, people do leverage my cancer history against me to hurt me for things, positions. I don't really take position, but like when I'm stating things about science, this is true, this isn't, we don't know this, etc., about controversial topics, people will write me and tell me they want me to die. And I very often, people will use their own likeness on Twitter and say, we're really sad he didn't die of cancer. And I'm always amazed people will use their own image and name to say such a heinous thing and to wish people to commit suicide. So that's a very destructive and sad element of our public discourse these days. And I can't help but take that personally, that anyone would wish such a thing after what I went through and I'm continuing to go through. I think the aftermath has been a very lonely experience because I always refer to it like the cancer was like you're in a black box theater and they made this whole chamber play set, for your whole experience. And let's say it's the set of Wit, and then they strike the set and everyone goes home and you're alone in this black box theater, but you're still dealing with the aftermath of what you went through and the permanence of it. But no one is really there particularly concerned about this. So that's been very difficult to have that lack of more constant support, understanding, and just people inquiry, asking how I'm doing, that kind of thing. It doesn't happen much anymore, but I'm still dealing with it. It's been
Okay.
a year since I finished treatment.
Okay. Well, I'm happy that you are still doing amazing work every day.
Yeah, thank
Um,
you.
Yeah, and I have an opening for a new friend, so if you're looking for one,
Yeah,
you need to apply.
yeah,
It's a process, but
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Uh,
So
okay.
I know you got to run eventually.
Hmm.
But this is really awesome talking to you.
Thanks.
Whether or not you think you're courageous, I definitely think you're courageous.